During World War II, American women took to the skies. They tested powerful warplanes just off the assembly line. They flew airplanes from factories to military bases. And behind the scenes, women engineers worked in aircraft factories. The Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum is honoring these amazing pioneering women with an exhibition, Women in Aviation During World War II. I'm Penny Colman with the Women's History Channel, and I'm here with Jessica Williams, the curator of this fascinating exhibition.
The Intrepid Museum celebrates each year with a program called Salute to Women, and this includes a number of different public programs and activities that acknowledge the contributions of women in history and science and engineering. And the exhibition Women in Aviation opened March 1st to really kick off our Salute to Women for 2012. During World War II, the American government was rallying all of its citizens to help support the war effort by participating in various activities on the home front. But in the case of women pilots, they really needed to go to the government, go to the military, and make the case for themselves to say, hey, we have this great skill, we're pilots, what can we do to help win victory for the Allies? There were a number of American women who really made the case for using women pilots during the war. One of those women was Jacqueline Cochran. She was a very prominent businesswoman and also a pilot, and she connected with Hap Arnold, General of the Army Air Forces, and made the case for starting a program for women to help fly within the Army. Another prominent woman was Nancy Harkness Love, who also had a similar idea to get women involved by ferrying planes across the U.S. The Women's Air Force Service pilots are perhaps the best known of the women pilot groups that flew for the U.S. military. There actually were two groups prior to the WASP, but the WASP was the one that really grew to prominence in 1943. So this was a program that, that accepted women who had some amount of flying experience. They were trained at a military base in Sweetwater, Texas, in military flying techniques. And these women came from across the country. And when they were trained, they went into a number of jobs with the military, including ferrying aircraft from place to place, including towing targets for anti-aircraft gunnery practice, which essentially meant that some of these women were flying airplanes, towing a target behind them, and anti-aircraft gunners were shooting at them with live ammunition, and other flying missions during the war.
Were these jobs dangerous?
Flying for the military is a dangerous job, and even though these women were only flying really in the United States, it's still dangerous to fly these military aircraft. So there were 38 women WASP pilots who lost their lives in service during the war. Unlike the other military service branches, so the WACs in the Army and the WAVEs in the Navy, the WASPs were not considered part of the Army Air Forces. They were actually considered civilian volunteers, which unfortunately meant that these women were not eligible for many of the benefits that, that male pilots were. Women were also involved on the ground in aviation during World War II. Of course, the story of Rosie the Riveter is very popular. Many people are aware of women who worked in aircraft factories as fabricators. But there were also women who were specifically trained as aviation engineers. The Curtiss Wright Company, for example, recruited a number of college-educated women to learn to be essentially airplane engineers. And once these women were trained with very intensive classes in engineering and mathematics, they went out to various Curtiss Wright factories to work as engineers. Women also worked in aircraft companies as test pilots during World War II. So for example, the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, which was based in Long Island, had 3 female test pilots during World War II, and they tested military aircraft that came off the assembly line, including some of the planes that were flown right here off the Intrepid. There is one of those types of aircraft right here on display at the museum. It is the TBF Avenger, and it's a torpedo bomber. And this is one of the types of planes that these women test pilots would have flown. One of my favorite women featured in the exhibition is KENYON. She was one of the test pilots who worked for the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. Her flight suit is on display in the exhibit. There's also another interesting artifact, very period artifact relating to Teddy Kenyon. Back during World War II, many of these women were featured in advertisements for various products, including cigarettes, which of course back then many more people smoked than today. And there is a Camel cigarette advertisement featuring Teddy Kenyon. It says, "I tame Hellcats" across the top. Hellcats were a type of fighter plane that she would have flown. And it shows Teddy flying her plane, and at the end, getting off, and the male pilot there being very impressed by her flying ability.
How did these women pilots and engineers challenge the traditional ideas at that time of what women could or couldn't do?
During World War II, with all these women entering the workforce, American society was trying to accept the idea of these new roles for women, that they could work outside the home and contribute in these non-traditional occupations. Well, for women pilots, it's even more non-traditional in a way. It's a very dangerous job. People didn't expect women to be handling this kind of complicated military hardware. Being a pilot involves making split-second decisions. So the idea that women could step up to the task, there was a lot of doubts about that among some men mostly. But generally, women stepped up to the plate. They were able to prove that they could accomplish these tasks that had seemed to be totally off limits to them before.
So what barriers did they face?
They faced all sorts of barriers from, in some cases, the missions and things that they were allowed to do were limited, so there were certain tasks that were considered appropriate for women pilots, not appropriate, and others that were considered inappropriate.
When World War II ended, what happened to women in aviation?
At the end of World War II, many women who served as pilots had hoped that they could continue flying for their careers, but unfortunately there were not really many options for women to serve as pilots after the war ended. And for the WASP, who served with the Army but were not technically considered part of the military, at the end of the war they were not eligible for any of the benefits that other veterans of the war were. So at that time, the women went back to their lives, and the story kind of died out for a while, until the 1970s, when interest in the women pilots picked up again. And that, in part, had to do with the fact that the Air Force was starting to train their first women pilots. And, the media was coming out and saying how this is the first time that women were serving in the Air Force. And these women from a generation before were saying, wait a minute, nobody remembers our story during World War II. So at that point, the WASP rallied together and managed to go before Congress and get themselves named as veterans of World War II. So they retroactively got acknowledged for their service during the war, which was 3 decades too late, I think, but they did finally manage to get the recognition that they deserved. In 2009, President Barack Obama awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the WASP. So surviving members of the WASP came to the White House and were acknowledged for their service. It's very important, I think, to acknowledge the story of these pioneering women. Many people don't know that women served as pilots during World War II, and I think it's important to acknowledge their contributions.
For the Women's History Channel, I'm Penny Colman.